Chat, this is good, right?
I had to like see it. So let's test it.
Hello. Again, last.
Different one.
Just a heads up. Just want to make sure everyone knows that this is not gonna be a very fun time. Like as you can see right here, it says trigger warning, genocide, sexual assault references. I just wanted to let you guys know ahead of time, we are gonna talk about some very gruesome stuff here. I haven't put anything up that is like gruesome, that would violate TOS or anything, but subjects that we're gonna talk about, it's not fun. But it does remind you of, you know, Gaza. It probably will remind you, a lot of what I'm about to remind you will remind you of Gaza, of what Israel is doing in Gaza, and sort of the history of Palestine within the past 80 years. Yeah, I'll just talk loud. I'm pretty good at that. I'm very good at talking loud and yelling into a mic, so I'm pretty good at that. Okay, so this is Eelam. This is Eelam, an anti-colonial struggle presented by, you know, me, Arun. Hi, you might have seen me around. Just a little bit of intro to who I am. I'm an Indian Tamil part-time political commentator, so I do this stuff part-time. I don't do this for work, obviously. I emphasize the fact that I'm Indian Tamil because that distinction is very important. I'm not Eelam Tamil, which is basically the people that we're going to be talking about today. I am of the same Tamil background, we belong to the same ethnic group, but my family and all comes from India, right? Our entire lineage comes from India. So the experiences that I'm about to lay out for everyone, I was fortunate enough to have that, none of that happened to my family. So I just want to make sure that I come from a position of relative privilege in comparison to the Eelam Tamils who have had to suffer this, right? And I'm also making a docuseries on the Eelam Tamil genocide called Grief-Stricken Winds Part 1 and Part 2 are already out. You can go to griefstrickenwinds.com. Please do, because a lot of the material that we're going to cover in these slides are actually, we had to cut a lot of that out. We had to cut it out partially due to Twitch TOS reasons, but also because I'm basically trying to summarize 80 years of settler colonialism and genocide within the span of an hour. So it's an impossible task. But you can go find me at twitch.tv/I don't know. You can also find me online with that same tag, I don't know, it'll be the same thing, on most sites, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, obviously. Facebook I'm not on. And then, yeah, that's about it. That's a little bit about me, but enough about me. I'm going to actually talk about this. I'm going to read this quote. Want to get a show of hands. I'll ask, it's a little bit of audience participation, but I want to see who you think might have said this. But remember that one day the whole country will look up to you. The final battle for our people will be fought in the deserts of Negev. You are men and women who will carry this country's destiny on your shoulders. Those who are attempting to divide this country will have to reckon. The country may forget you for a few years, but one day, very soon, they will look up to you as the last bastion of the Jews. Who do you think might have said this? Anyone?
Herzl.
Herzl?
Moshe Dayan.
Who?
Moshe Dayan is like a military crook.
Okay. Anyone else? Ben Gurion? Okay. You're actually not, who said Ben Gurion? James? Not far off. I'll get to why that is in a second. You're not that far off. You're probably the closest that anyone's going to get here, actually.
Golda Meir.
Golda Meir, okay. Okay. Got you. Next slide. I'm not worried about the opinions of the Arabs now. Now we cannot think of them, not about their lives or of their opinion about us. The more you put pressure in Gaza, the happier our people will be here. Really, if I starve the Arabs, our people will be happy. Who do you think might have said that? Netanyahu. Anyone else?
It's like ethnicities have been changed, and it's actually quote about Iran. Why is that?
Anyone else?
Forget I said that.
He didn't say anything. Forget what he said. He said he was just blabbering. Anyone else? Any ideas? Hitler? Okay, all very good guesses. Just keep that in mind. Keep these two quotes in mind, okay? Okay, so country A, let's just call this country A, okay? This country is formed as a result of the British handing off power to a group of politicians and other, sort of elite group of people, politicians, bureaucrats, ideologically minded sort of people, like, you can say politicians, aristocrats, you could also say. So this country is formed as a result of basically British imperialism and handing power off to a bunch of people in 1948 specifically, right? What ensues is a series of settler colonies that are set up for a particular ethnic group. Let's call them People A. So these settler colonies are for People A. They're set up by People A for People A. That recently gained consciousness over the past several centuries. The sort of national consciousness, nationalist consciousness over the past several centuries. Then also what happens is ethnic pogroms against the people, against the people already living near the settler colonies, that's People B, right? They start occurring. Ethnic pogroms, mass ethnic pogroms, hundreds, thousands, so on and so forth, are slaughtered in the pursuit of this nationalist consciousness. And then as a result of those pogroms, militant groups form to resist the occupying state forces. Then war ensues between the militant groups and the state, the occupying state. And then the state also commits heinous amounts of, heinous genocidal war crimes, and they commit a lot of war crimes against People B. Country A continued. So the underlying nationalist myth of Country A is as follows. The entirety of the land belongs to People A. A religious figure, and the reason that the entirety of the land belongs to People A is that some religious figure said that that land belongs to People A. That is his chosen people, and so the entire land belongs to them. And this is from like 3,000 years ago. So People A used to live there 3,000 years ago, but then People B eventually stole the land through invasions and settling, and basically drove People A out. Does this sound familiar by any stretch of the measure? I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here. This kind of sounds familiar a little bit, right? And then as a result, it is the duty of People A to retake the land from People B by any means necessary, especially through mass slaughter and mass sexual assault. Country A, which this ultimately culminates in the following. The herding of civilians belonging to People B, so People B, are herded into safe zones, largely located around hospitals and schools that have been converted into hospitals. And then the relentless bombing of those safe zones with the explicit purpose of killing as many civilians as humanly possible, while also denying aid and medical supplies. And then also mass sexual assault of the men, women, and children, especially for decades on end. Okay, so you've seen the title of this, so you definitely know for a fact this isn't Israel that I'm talking about, right? But you got to admit, as I was describing all of this, it kind of sounds like it could have been Israel, right? It could have been Israel. If we actually go back, let's start replacing this. The country that I'm actually talking about, that is the Israel of South Asia, at least a genocide, obviously. This is the point that I'm getting at here. So people think, when I say something like this, they think I'm talking about Israel. I'm not talking about Israel. I'm talking about Sri Lanka. I'm talking about Sri Lanka, pearl of the Indian Ocean. And I say Sri Lanka, not India. This is not to absolve India of anything, just to be clear. But I do get this a lot. Whenever I do talk about Eelam and I talk about Sri Lanka, people will bring up as though this conflict is happening in India. I do end up having to repeat that, no, this is a different country, this is a different thing. So Sri Lanka, not India. So where is Sri Lanka? And where is Eelam? So Sri Lanka is situated right there, the island of Sri Lanka rather, and this goes by multiple different names. I mean, Sri Lanka is now the most common name for this island. It used to be called Ceylon, right? You may have heard that name. The Tamil name for this entire island was actually Eelam. So the name for this island used to be called Eelam at some point. But later on, as sort of Tamils started picking up arms, the Vatukote resolution passed, basically demanding a separate Tamil Eelam. The term Eelam actually came to be conflated with this portion of the island, these portions of the island, and that is specifically Tamariram, which is the Tamil dominant portions of the island, right? The Tamil speaking dominant portions of the island. These areas are currently under military occupation by Sri Lanka right now. There are, military bases set up all over that are occupying land. And in fact, Sri Lanka has the second highest military personnel to civilian ratio after Israel. Kashmir is the most militarized zone, period. Right? So in terms of raw numbers, Kashmir has the highest amount of military personnel, period. But in terms of military personnel to civilian ratio, the ratio, Sri Lanka follows Israel. So we're going to take a quick understanding as to who these people are, like who are the inhabitants of the island first and foremost. Just a little bit of context. The guy on the left is the Benjamin Netanyahu of Sri Lanka. His name is Mahinda Rajapaksa. And I put him up there because he kind of looks stupid. He just looks very angry. He looks very distressed. It suits him, honestly. So the Sinhalese, they are the majority of the island, roughly 75% of the population. They are mostly, almost overwhelmingly Theravada Buddhists, with a minority of Christians. And the language that they speak, and the reason I mention this is it's kind of important, is they speak the Sinhala language. The Sinhala language is an Indo-Aryan language, meaning it's related to languages like Hindi, Punjabi, Gujarati, Bengali, Assamese, so on and so forth. Now the reason, it's also related to Kashmiri as well, right? Now the reason I mentioned this in the first place is this has a tie-in with the racial theory of Aryans, in that this linguistic category was actually discovered first. And it's actually because of British colonization. They actually wanted to streamline the colonization of the subcontinent, and they found out that these languages, along with the liturgical language of Sanskrit and Pali, they were distant relatives of Persian as well as Latin and Greek. So, British administrators, and then later, race scientists like Max Muller, so on and so forth, formulated this idea that a lot of the people of the subcontinent, especially those who speak these languages, and Europeans, they're European colonizers, they come from one racial group called Aryans. So this is actually a group basically formulated by the Brits, right? And they basically took a word from, I think it was the Rig Veda, called Arya. Arya meant noble. And they basically took that and said, no, all of these people, including these guys, stem from a noble race called the Aryans, right? Master race, as it were. But the thing is, especially the nationalists of the Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists, as we call them, or Sinbuds for short, they actually took this idea of being Aryans and they ran with it. So a lot of the theories, so we talked about how they, this land used to belong to them some 3,000 years ago. And it was these bloody Tamils that came across and invaded our land and destroyed our civilization. The main thing that they're, proposing, that they're positing, is that the civilization that the Sinhalese used to have 3,000 years ago was this glorious Aryan hydraulic, especially hydraulic civilization. And that's why there's a lot, that's kind of why a lot of the settler colonial programs that are, being employed by the Sri Lankan government against the Tamils have a lot to do with basically making the dry zones, wet, or irrigating the dry zones, basically making the dry zones bloom, as it were. And so you can, as oversimplification of this, you can basically say they're the Israelis of this equation. Yeah, and they're largely concentrated in the south and the west of the island, but they generally form a huge majority of the island. So for the Eelam Tamils, I picked a picture of women who are doing a protest called the Families of the Disappeared protest. And these are women whose sons were forcibly disappeared by the Sri Lankan state, never to be seen again. And this happened during the war, and even after the war this happened. And so these women are protesting, they're demanding that the Sri Lankan government return their children. So the Eelam Tamils, they go by different names, and it's a bit of a contentious term, right? But this is the term that a lot of people prefer, that I think the majority prefer actually. They're also called Sri Lankan Tamils or Ceylonese Tamils. And they're the largest minority of the island. They're concentrated in the northeast of the island, the one that I showed you earlier, around the coasts. So they're mostly Shaivite Hindu. Hindu, again, that's a term that I don't want to get into right now, but Hindu is already kind of a catch-all term for different religious beliefs. But the majority of Eelam Tamils are actually majority Tamil Shaivite. So they believe that Shiva and Murugan and these deities are basically their ancestors. They're the ancestors of the Tamils, in a sense. And they revere deities like Shiva, Murugan, Ganesha, you might have heard of the elephant god Ganesha, so on and so forth. So that's the majority of their religious beliefs, but they also have a minority of Christians as well. There's also a relatively large amount of Tamils in Colombo as well. And there's also kind of a disconnect between, generally speaking, the beliefs of the Tamils living in Colombo and the beliefs of the Tamils living in occupied Eelam. And massive oversimplification here, but you can kind of say they're the Palestinians of this equation. So then there's two more ethnic groups I want to talk about, just to make sure I cover my bases here. I don't have time to talk about their situations in particular, but I can basically kind of say this. Third largest ethnic group of the island are the Ceylonese Moors, or the Sri Lankan Moors. That is the legal term for them, but they actually prefer to be just called Muslims. And the reason is this identity is almost entirely based on the religion of Islam. So they profess that the religious identity is the most important part of their identity. They've completely disowned any sense of linguistic identity. They're the third largest group. They're all Muslim, and then the language that they speak is predominantly Tamil. So the vast majority of them speak Tamil at home, but a lot of them are actually bilingual in both Sinhalese and Tamil. They're actually scattered all over the island, and their situation often depends on who they're most in contact with. The kind of bigotry that they face often depends on who they're most in contact with. Especially in the south, they also face a lot of discrimination from Sinbuds, but the kind of discrimination that they face and the kind of bigotry that they face is actually not what you would expect for Islamophobia, actually. The kind of bigotry that Sri Lankan Muslims face, generally speaking, the predominant form of bigotry is actually just rebranded anti-Semitism. So instead of, this idea of, white supremacists saying, oh, Jews run the banks, Jews do this, Jews do that, just replace Jewish people with Muslims. And that's what Sinbuds say about Muslims, right? So the conspiracy is that these guys are running the banks, they're running the markets, they're doing all of the money stuff, and they're trying to sterilize our babies, so on and so forth. And that actually, people were actually arrested over just conspiracies of sterilization coming from Muslim doctrines. And then the fourth largest ethnic group are called the Mullivaikkal Tamils, or the Hill Tamils. On Wikipedia, they're listed as the Indian Tamils of Sri Lanka, which gives you an idea of what their origin is. They're actually indentured servants brought by the British during British colonization in order to have them work the tea plantations in the highlands of Kandy. And so their demographics are actually quite similar to the Eelam Tamil demographic. And actually during a lot of the ethnic pogroms that Eelam Tamils face, these guys also face it as well, because to the Sinbud nationalists, there is no difference between the Mullivaikkal Tamils or the Eelam Tamils. This difference doesn't exist in their mind because, and in many ways, this population is often used as, these guys are the scapegoats to attack Eelam Tamils. What I mean by that is, when Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists say the Tamils are recent immigrants, they're invading and replacing us, right? They cite these guys as the foremost example of that, the Mullivaikkal Tamils. And they face lots of discrimination based on caste, class, and ethnicity. The difference is the dialect that these guys speak is probably more similar to the stuff that you'll hear in India, in southern India. We are going to gloss through basically everything. We're just going to give you an overview of the timeline. So 1948, the Solberry Constitution is adopted. 1947, 1948, the Solberry Constitution is adopted. And D.S. Senanayake becomes the first Prime Minister of Ceylon, later Sri Lanka. Right? So then starting in 1948 itself, the Sri Lankan government starts setting up settler colonies in the north and east of the island. So the most well-known of this era is the Galoya colony in what is now Ampara district. Back then it was called Badikalo district. It is the Galoya colony, and basically they were building a dam in the southeastern part of the island. And so what they did is they took Sinhalese landless peasants and put them in a Muslim majority district, Muslim majority Tamil minority district. So the demography at the time was that Muslims were the majority of the southern half of Badikalo district, and then Tamils were the largest minority of what would later become Ampara district, right? There's a colony set up in Galoya, which is now in Ampara. There's several set up in Trincomalee. I think they also start setting up, there's one in Serugala, there's the Kandalai colony, Alai colony, all of these different colonies that are set up in Trinco district. And Trinco is super important because it is home to one of the deepest natural harbors in the world. So you saw earlier where Sri Lanka is. It's in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And if you have influence there, you have access to Eastern Africa, Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia. You also have access to MENA. You also have access to Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Iraq, UAE, Bahrain, so on and so forth. You have direct access to South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, right? You can directly check India if you have influence in Sri Lanka, right? In Trinco especially, right? In occupied England. But you also have access to Southeast Asia, and you also have access to China, right? So Sri Lanka the island of Sri Lanka, Eelam, is placed very strategically. It's an unsinkable aircraft carrier, as it were. So they start setting up colonies in the north and east of the island, and they arm those colonies, right? They give them guns, and actually the first pogroms that happen around those colonies. So starting in 1956, 1958, 1974, 1977, 1981, 1983, you actually have a bunch of anti-Tamil pogroms that happen for a variety of different reasons. 1956 is because single-out-only act was passed. 1958 is because of the Sri agitation, the anti-Sri agitation. 1974 is the World Tamil Congress. 1977 is, it's actually SLFP that is attacking Tamils for supporting UNP. 1981 is the burning of the Jaffna Library. In 1981 is the Jaffna Library. 1983 is Black July, which we're going to emphasize. And Black July is actually, this week is the anniversary of Black July. And then starting in 1983, starting with Black July, full-scale war breaks out on the island. Basically, the Tamil militant groups start fighting the Sri Lankan government directly. All of the gloves come off, basically. This is when the war crimes really kick into high gear. And then in 2009, January 2009, Sri Lanka basically starts designating zones around hospitals as safe zones, which again, we won't delve into too much here. I highly recommend you watch Reef Stricken Winds in order to get this context. But Sri Lanka basically herds Tamil civilians into safe zones around hospitals and schools, and then they bomb them relentlessly. And they also denied aid and medical goods to the civilians in and around those hospitals. And then starting in 1983 itself, or even earlier than that, I said 1983, it was probably even earlier than that. It's definitely earlier than that. Sri Lankan security forces, including the military police, terrorism investigation department, criminal investigation department, basically paramilitary forces, everyone. They would literally kidnap Tamils, sexually assault them, disappear them, never to be seen again. And this is a phenomenon that would go in even long after the war, and it's still an ongoing thing, mainly because you have Tamil families, especially in occupied Eelam, they're trying to get closure, they're trying to get justice for their family. 1950s to present. I do want to show you at some point I want to show you guys the Wikipedia page, because there is a Wikipedia page specifically dedicated to listing the documented cases of sexual violence that the Sri Lankan state and all of its arms, along with the Indian government, by the way, has committed against Eelam Tamils as well. Well, not just Eelam Tamils, but Mullivaikkal Tamils as well. There's an entire Wikipedia page on this. Starting in the 1950s, the Sri Lankan government would just mass sexually assault and rape Tamil men, women, and children. And there's actually a lot of sexual assault against men. It kind of illustrates the point that sexual assault is about power, ultimately, exerting power and making someone feel weak. What Sri Lanka does is a great example of that. And then a lot of political intrigue happens and no justice ever happens for the Tamils. They're still under occupation and they're still brutalized by the cops. They're still brutalized for simply trying to commemorate their dead as late as 2023. In 2024, a socialist, and I say this in air quotes, because he markets himself as a Marxist-Leninist, a principled Marxist-Leninist that says the real problem is, those Tamil nationalists that are, bourgeois reactionaries. They're the real problem, and the only way to actually build a social state is by crushing them. So it turns out that the JVP, Anurag Kumar Dissanayake, that party ended up being one of the biggest cheerleaders of the war crimes in Mullivaikkal, especially. And so he wins the presidential elections in 2024. His coalition, the NPP, the JVP-led coalition, the National People's Power, NPP, wins the parliamentary elections in 2024, which is last year. So we talked about this quote earlier, right? Who said this? But remember that one day the whole country will look up to you, the final battle for our people will be fought in the deserts of Negev, yada, yada, yada. Whoa, surprise, it's not an Israeli guy. It's, whoa, who saw that coming? No. So it's actually Diaz. Who saw that coming? No, it's Diaz Senanayake, the first Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. But remember that one day the whole country will look up to you, the final battle for our people will be fought on the plains of Padalia. You are men and women who will carry this country's destiny on your shoulders. Those who are attempting to divide this country will have to reckon with you. The country may forget you for a few years, but one day, very soon, they will look up to you as the last bastion of the Sinhala. Don Stephen Senanayake, first Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. this is the guy that launched the settler colonies in Galoya, Kandalai, so on and so forth. So his grandson is reported that he said this.
Is his name actually Don?
Yes. There are lots of Sri Lankan politicians. We're going to talk about a politician who has a more ridiculous name than this. So get ready for this. So DS Senanaike is a figure that's actually he's not talked about a lot, especially within, I guess, the discourse of Sri Lankan politics. And it's because he's actually not seen as like the really racist guy in Sri Lankan politics. It's actually the fourth prime minister, which we'll talk about shortly. You know, we'll briefly touch on him. That's really seen as the racist guy. But his party is the United National Party. It's a very neoliberal party, pro-West party. They launched the Galoya colony, which led to the creation of an Ampara district with a minority Sinhala population. So what happened was, they pumped to Galoya, which is in the eastern part, with a lot of Sinhalese settlers, to the point that the largest minority of the southern part of Badikalo district ended up being Sinhalese. It used to be Tamil, but the Sinhalese actually displaced the Tamils from that position. And then as a result of that, in 1961, once they pumped that area with enough settlers, the Sri Lankan government actually carved Badikalo district in half. They carved it in two. And then the southern portion became Ampara district. And the main city that was actually built to house the dam workers, the settlers, is 99% Sinhalese out of that. So he also, as I mentioned earlier, he launched settler colonial projects in Trincomalee district. I mentioned why Trincomalee is important. Trincomalee used to be a majority Tamil population, the Muslim minority. Now it's flipped, partially because of the ethnic pogroms that Sri Lankan government and Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist mobs engaged in against the Tamils, but also partially because of the full-blood war. So the largest minority in Trincomalee district, which is a very important district, is now minority Tamil, majority Muslim. I want to say a quote from Malinga Gunaratnam, who was a bureaucrat within later administrations. DS Senanaike, Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, identified this threat being the demand for a separate Eelam, even before the first gunshot in the quest of the separate state was fired. He proceeded to strengthen Trincomalee in the hinterland. Padavia, which lies north of Trincomalee, was resettled with Sinhala people. Sarawilla and Ampara, Sarawilla is part of Trincomalee district, and Ampara, which are on the periphery, were developed with bustling townships. He played his cards very close to his chest. Not even his son Dudley, who later became Prime Minister, the second Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, fully understood his father's mind. DS Senanaike's chief confidant was Richard Gotabaya Senanaike, his brother's son. These two stalwarts are to Sri Lanka what David Ben-Gurion and Yigal Allon are to Israel. Now he's saying this, by the way, not to be like Israel bad. He's not saying that. He's saying, no, he's taking a page out of Israel, and that's good, right? This guy is basically our David Ben-Gurion. And it makes sense, he's the first leader of the country as well. Feel like, and by the way, this isn't just me making this connection. I want to be clear about that. The reason I brought this quote up is that it's not me making this connection. It's people within the Sri Lankan government that are noticing the similarities and noticing this connection already. And I'm far from the only person to talk about this. There are plenty of people that are noticing the parallels between the story of Sri Lanka and Eelam and Israel and Palestine. So, quickly, let's talk about the anti-Tamil pogroms because I don't have time to fully go through them. But in 1956, Sri Lanka passes the Sinhala-only Act under Prime Minister, and I swear to God this is his name, Solomon West Ridgeway Diaz Bandaranaike, and the Sri Lanka Freedom Party. That's his actual name, SWRD. And as a result, basically what this law does is it replaced English as the sort of linked language with Sinhala as the only language of the island, as the only official language of the island. As a result, Tamils obviously protest. The federal party started protesting. And then, as a reprisal, Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist mobs killed 200 plus Tamils, especially around the Galoya colony. In 1958, there was a push to basically Sinhalaize the name of, at this point it was called Ceylon. They wanted to turn it into Sri Lanka, the name into Sri Lanka. So they started writing the word Sri in the Sinhalese language, in the Sinhalese script, on license plates. So then the Tamils, they protest that by adding tar, by blacking it out. And then upwards of, hundreds, if not thousands of Tamils were killed as a reprisal. reprisal. In 1977, at this point, Vatu Kote resolution is written by the 12th Party, which one of the main members is SJP Salvanayaka. So the Vatu Kote resolution basically says, enough. We tried working with the Sri Lankan government. We tried working with the current establishment. This isn't going to work. We need a separate Tamil League. And then at this point in time, we just mentioned SWRD, Bandaranaike. At this point, his wife is now in power, right? And actually his wife, Sri Bandaranaike, is the first woman prime minister of the world. So she loses to the SLFP, she loses to the UNP in the they get blown out. And then, as a result, pro-Bandaranaike and SLFP Singhwoods attacked Tamils, killing up to about 300. And in particular, they also went for a lot of Malayaga Tamils as well. In 1981, police and Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist mobs go into the Jaffna Public Library. Jaffna is a city on the northernmost tip of the island. It's basically on that peninsula that's at the very top. There's a library there that housed priceless artifacts that were, known to the Tamils, and they basically went in and burned it down. And 97,000 volumes, historical volumes, a lot of them priceless artifacts on like palm leaf manuscripts, gone, lost to history forever. Complete loss to history, we're never getting them back. This is an act of cultural genocide. And then we get to the formation of the LTTE. At this point in time, basically Tamil students, especially in the north, kind of were fed up with this entire thing, naturally so. So then they started forming militant groups. Originally the first one was called the Tamil New Tigers. And then the Tamil New Tigers, as a result of the Tamil World Conference attacks, they started attacking. They killed the mayor of Jaffna, Alfred Durayappa, because he's part of the same party that sent the police in to attack the Tamils, attacking the electrical wires and electrocuting like 11 people. So these guys basically get fed up, right? And they're done with this entire situation. And so the Tamil New Tigers gets formed, and then a couple years later, those same people basically start forming the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. You might have heard of these guys. They're called the LTTE or the Tamil Tigers. You've probably heard of this before, the Tamil Tigers. There's a bit of nuance to that in that between the 80s and 90s, basically any militant group, if you remember a militant group, you were called a tiger. So it's a bit vague, but only after the 90s does really the word tiger specifically refer to LTTE. And then at this time you had militant groups like Eros, Float, so on and so forth that also arose, but they all surrender after the Indo-Lanka Accord, and LTTE is basically the only one that doesn't surrender, because even though India they trained the Tamil militants originally, they gave them aid originally, the LTTE kind of knew that the Indians were just using them, and so they were just like, nah, I don't like this. So they saw through India's ruse, and they just called it a day. And then they started. So then what happened was, as a result of the Indo-Lanka Peace Accord, the Indian Army, they sent the peacekeeping forces into Jaffna, into Eelam, and the peacekeeping forces also committed war crimes against the Tamils. So by the 90s, the LTTE is the only remaining militant group that's fighting against the Sri Lankan government. We get to Black July, 1983. So this week is actually the anniversary of Black July, basically starting around July 22nd, July 23rd, basically towards the end of the month. What happened was, this is a planned pogrom. This was not just simply random, madness that was happening all over the island, as it's, often portrayed. What's actually going on here is that this was a very well-planned pogrom from the highest levels of the Sri Lankan government, because they were the ones that were providing these fascist mobs with voter rolls. And these voter rolls actually contained the addresses of Tamils, like Tamil homes, Tamil-owned shops, Tamil-owned businesses, and it just provided them an easy way to locate those Tamils and target them. I actually personally know someone that actually escaped Black July. I know people that have escaped Black July. Thousands of Tamils would be killed across the island. And we're going to put up a bunch of quotes on the screen, and we're going to go through them one by one, but massive trigger warning, it is going to be very harrowing to talk about. Let's start with this, the bottom quote, because I can read it easier. So, while traveling on a bus when a mob laid siege to it, passengers walked as a small boy was hacked to limbless death. the bus driver was ordered to give up a Tamil. He pointed out a woman who was desperately trying to erase a mark on her forehead called a kungumam as the thugs bore down on her. The woman's belly was ripped open with a broken bottle, and she was immolated, set on fire, as people clapped and danced. In another incident, two sisters, one 18 and one 11, were decapitated and raped, the latter until there was nothing left to violate and no volunteers could come forward, after which she was burned. While all this was going on, a line of Buddhist monks appeared, arms flailing, their voices raised in a delirium of exhortation, summoning the Sinhala to put all Tamils to death. Ms. Ellie Starstein, back home in Stavanger, Norway, I don't know how to pronounce that, I apologize, told how she and her 15-year-old daughter, Kristen, witnessed one massacre. A minibus full of Tamils were forced to stop in front of us in Colombo. A Sinhalese mob poured petrol over the bus and set it on fire. They blocked the car door and prevented the Tamils from leaving the vehicle. Hundreds of spectators watched as about 20 Tamils were burned to death. Ms. Skarstein added, "We can't believe the official casualty figures. Hundreds, maybe thousands, must have been killed already." The police force, which was 95% Sinhalese, did nothing to stop the mobs. There was no mercy. Women, children, and old people were slaughtered. People did nothing to stop the genocide. Now at the top, we found this in a book somewhere, and so take that quote with a huge grain of salt, but if you actually understand the full history of the island and kind of the most gross aspects of what these Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist mobs have done, it's not a stretch to believe that they might have done that as well. Tamil meat available, quote unquote. This sort of announcement could be seen in a number of butcher stalls in Colombo on 26th and 27th July. Ooh, 26th July, that's today. In some of them, severed heads of Tamilians were exhibited. It seemed as if the land of Buddhists turned into a land of cannibals. Another thing, by the way, that Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists did was they did a shibboleth, which is to say that they would actually word test. They would actually pull people out of buses, or they would just randomly stop people left and right, and they would ask them to say a word in the Sinhalese language. And if it turns out the person saying it had some sort of accent, they had some sort of, they couldn't say it properly or whatever, they were beaten to death immediately on the spot. So that's another thing that they did. Here's more. A young shore worker in Colombo was forced to watch the gang rape of his mother by a Sinhala gang, who hit him and his mother every time he tried to close his eyes. His mother was then killed, and he was told, quote, "This is what Tamil whores deserve." He subsequently joined the LTTE and became a political leader in the organization. On 25th July 1983, around 1:30 p.m., a Tamil survivor witnessed, this is going back to an earlier story, but it's a different perspective, witnessed the gang rape and killing of two Tamil sisters aged 18 and 11. So it's the same story as earlier, but it's a different perspective. The elder sister went on her knees and begged them to not harm her 11-year-old sister, who was then hacked to death in front of the 18-year-old with derisive laughter from the mob. The elder sister was then gang raped by about 20 Sinhala men before being burned alive. The witness also reported seeing several naked Tamil rape victims in a Colombo refugee camp who had been stripped of their clothes on the street and were being ogled at by Sri Lankan soldiers. Let's revisit this quote again. "I'm not worried about the opinions of the Arabs now, blah, 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 blah." Surprise, surprise. It was Julius Richard Jayawardena, president of Sri Lanka. And he was president of Sri Lanka as this was happening, as Black July was happening. So I'm not worried about the opinion of the Jaffna people, aka Tamils now. We cannot think of them, not about their lives or their opinion about us. The more we put pressure in the north, the happier our people will be here. Really, if I starve the Tamils, our people will be happy. Julius Richard Jayawardena, the president of Sri Lanka at this point in time. We are going to gloss basically over all of this. For this, you have to watch part 2, or Sri Lanka's Killing Fields, or any of those documentaries. You can go to griefstrickenwinds.com. But at this point, the Tamil militants start fighting with the Sri Lankan government. The Sri Lankan government buys weapons from and gets training from every major country. You'll see what I mean in a second. And many heinous war crimes are committed by the Sri Lankan government against Tamil civilians. So imagine what you're seeing in Gaza, and James can back this up, by the way, because he's seen the documentary. What you're seeing in Gaza right now, almost bar for bar, was done in occupied Eelam. Almost bar for bar. Everything you can imagine. Deliberately setting people on fire, necklacing, mass rapes, bombing of hospitals, everything. everything that you can imagine. Denial of aid, leading to potential dysentery, cholera, these sorts of situations, bombing of churches, bombing of religious sites. Everything that you're seeing in Gaza today was done all throughout the past several decades to the Tamils by the Sri Lankan government. That's partially why I made it, just to give you an idea, is to give you a rough idea of actually what happened here. And also, I didn't mention this in part 2, it's just a small, tiny little bit of tidbit. Between 2004 and 2007, just casually, Sri Lankan peacekeepers ran a child sex trafficking ring out of Haiti. As they were committing genocide against the Tamils, they found time to run a child sex trafficking ring out of Haiti, and they repeatedly sexually assaulted Haitian children to the point where those children in Haiti actually learned the sexual innuendos in the Sinhalese language. Casually found time for it. Mullivaikkal Massacres / genocide. Like I said, starting in 2009, Sri Lanka basically declared safe zones, they're called no-fire zones in this case, around hospitals. There were 3 of them. One was in Pudukkottai, next was in Pudukkottai, and then the third was finally in Mullivaikkal, which was centered around Mullivaikkal. As soon as they declared those no-fire zones, these no-fire zones are zones that neither the LTTE nor the Sri Lankan government are supposed to fire in, right? Because they're housing civilians, right? But as soon as these no-fire zones were declared, Sri Lanka decides to start bombing them immediately. And in fact, they did something called a double tap, which is they would bomb those zones to specifically lure out, like they would kill a bunch of people, lure out the families of the people they just killed, and then immediately bomb the place again, specifically to kill those family members as well. And then they also denied aid, added throughout this entire process as well. You had Sinhalese nationalist mobs basically pelt stones at the Red Cross office because, Red Cross is also LTTE, everyone's LTTE. The UN is LTTE, America's LTTE, China's LTTE, everyone's LTTE. But in the final no-fire zone around Mullivaikkal, around 300,000 people were there. 300,000 people. If we were to pull out a map of Eelam right here, Mullivaikkal is yay big. Tiny, 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 tiny. You could walk from end to end in about 10 minutes. 300,000 people were there. There was no hospital facilities. There was no admission ward. There was nothing. Right? The admission ward was all outside. There were no hospital beds at that point in time. Everyone was laying out on the beach, trying to get treatment there. So then, on the final day of this, entire massacre, of this genocidal massacre, 3,000 people were instantly killed in one day, followed by an extra 25,000 people being critically injured. Now, at this point in time, if you're injured, that means you're dead. So the final day, before this all ended, roughly 28,000 people died in one day. Sri Lanka killed 28,000 civilians. I need you to understand that. In one day, and got away with it. I need you all to understand that. If you want to know more about this, and I beg you, please learn more about this, there's Sri Lanka's killing fields. I know the folks that did it, they're fantastic souls for doing it. Remember May 2009, there's a website called remembermay2009.com. Please go there. And then I've also made Grief Stricken Wins Part 2 that basically matches these two together, actually. So what I do is I match these two here. After the war, because, Sri Lanka ended the war, so everything is good, right? No more terrorism, right? We're all good. No more terrorism. What do you mean? There's no problem here. Terrorism's gone. Turns out, no, it's not all over. Because even after the war ended, there's mass enforced disappearances. There's this thing called the white van phenomenon that actually started in the early 2000s but continued even after the war, where officials from the government would basically go to people they suspected of being terrorists, their homes, and just kidnap people just to have them never be seen again. That's what the Sri Lankan government did. They would just randomly kidnap people and say, too bad, you're never going to get your, husband or son or daughter or wife back. Too bad. And Sri Lanka actually has the second highest number of enforced disappearances of any country. This country does. Think about it. Didn't expect it to be this, did you?
For highest enforced experiences.
Oh, what's the highest? I don't know. People say it's either Syria or it's Yemen, depending on who you ask. But we know that Sri Lanka probably has the second highest, if not the highest. There's an ongoing military occupation. There are military camps dotted all over the town-dominated areas. There's checkpoints everywhere. There's military checkpoints everywhere. They don't have necessarily freedom of movement, right? The Eelam Tamils don't have freedom of movement. On top of that, mass rapes and sexual assaults continue to occur even after, right? And this is also accompanied with police detention and torture, among many different things. So this is where things get really uncomfortable. Sri Lanka, even after the war ended in 2009, continued to engage and enforce disappearances, kidnappings, especially the sexual assault of Tamil men, women, and children. The UCLA School of Law, Health and Human Rights Project, ran the All Survivors Project for male war victims of sexual abuse. They identified the following common forms of abuse by Sri Lankan security forces. There's all that. This is one thing I do want to note is that both of these cases happened 5 years after the war. So the excuse of, these guys are LTTE terrorists. LTTE is dead. Prabhakaran is dead at this point in time. His family's dead. They killed his entire family, right? So what excuse? This one is involving a 9 and 11-year-old up there. What's their excuse for that? I don't know. I guess everyone's LTTE. So this is from a report done by International Truth and Justice Project. And this is from a report called Unsilenced. All of these, now the thing about this that's unique is that all of the cases that you're seeing here, the victims are all male. They're all male. So I want to make you understand what that means. The sexual violence against Tamil men was so pervasive and systematic that you could make a report on this. And it's still kind of ongoing. I'll just read the too harsh quotes. I'll just say what they've said. Tamil dog, you will be dead if you do not hold it. You Tamils need a separate state. If you want a separate state, you'll have to take a bath in our urine. He told me you are a dog Tamil dog, and you should not have any future generations. This will be the fate of the Tamils. These are police officers saying this, by the way. These are cops saying this to their torture victims. This is all happening years after the war. This report was released in 2018. So this stuff was happening from 2009 to 2018. This is not during the war. So what's Sri Lanka's excuse for this, is my question. So the thing I also wanted to bring your attention to, because I don't think anyone else is really talking about this, is that Sri Lanka has a high amount of mass graves. Eelam and Sri Lanka have a high amount of mass graves. All over the island, actually. And there's a possibility that a lot of the hotels that are run by the Sri Lankan army themselves also house mass graves. There's a good chance of that as well. So right now there's an excavation happening in Chemani, in Jaffna district, which is the northernmost district of Sri Lanka, or Eelam actually, occupied Eelam rather. And so far, as of today, I actually checked today before coming here, over 100 bodies have been found in that mass grave. 100. 5 to 6 were infants. We found the skull of an infant in that mass grave. And there was a 4 to 5-year-old schoolgirl that was found alongside her doll, the book bag, and glass bangles. Those are her shoes, her Bata brand shoes, and that's her doll that they just uncovered over the past month. So we're actually getting close to the end of this. So you're probably sitting here and wondering, okay, so why have I heard nothing of this? Why am I hearing about this for the first time from you or from people around you? Why has no one said anything about this? And you're looking at one of the many reasons why. These are all the countries that either supplied military weapons, that supplied weapons to Sri Lanka, or they provided military assistance to Sri Lanka. Recognize anyone there? It's the entire planet. The entire planet sold weapons to Sri Lanka, basically. I don't think I have seen a coalition quite like this. And the reason you see a coalition this insane, this is a coalition that left is dreaming. But unfortunately it's used for war crimes, committing war crimes and genocide. No, the reason is, I mentioned earlier, the island of Sri Lanka is located very strategically in the Indian Ocean. So it's not that these guys are working together, they're competing against each other for influence in Sri Lanka. That's what's going on here. So this is one of many reasons why you've never heard of this. Because the truth of the matter is, if someone were to point the finger and say, hey, why are you helping Sri Lanka? Well, Spider-Man meme comes up and you can basically say, hey, you also help Sri Lanka. your hand was also in the cookie jar as well. So no one wants to rock the boat fundamentally. And so as a result, I think in a sense, being pro-Eelam, in my opinion, is one of the most anti-colonial positions you can take. Because you are fighting against all the colonial powers at once. And also some of the wannabe colonial powers like India. So this is one of many reasons like you've never heard of this before. Another reason is because, I'm gonna be honest, we're all kind of brown. And it's an island somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And so just this general region of politics isn't seen as really super pertinent to, everyone's interests. But the irony is that this country, Sri Lanka, actually served as a model for Israel. Former, Israeli intelligence agents are saying this. There's a Jerusalem Post article that was just, released talking about how they want to replicate the Mahinda Rajapaksa model in Israel. There are counter-insurgency think tanks here in the United States operating, saying, making stuff like a Rajapaksa plan for the total elimination of Hamas, saying, hey, wait a minute, Sri Lanka managed to finish off the LTTE, why can't we finish off Hamas? So ironically, Sri Lanka served as a blueprint for what Israel is doing now. And Israel admitted as much. Israelis admitted as much. Americans admitted as much. I guess my sort of message to you guys before I take questions is, one, whenever we talk about the ongoing occupation and genocide of the Palestinians, it's also important to bring this up because this is a model for Israel. And also, Israel sold weapons to Sri Lanka as well. And Mossad and Shin Bet, along with British agencies as well, trained Sri Lankan police to commit heinous war crimes against the Tamils, especially during the 90s and the 80s. But that's it. I had to cut a lot of things short for this presentation, but I hope you guys liked it. Questions? Anyone has questions?
So there's this book called By Way of Deception, written by a former Mossad agent.
Yes, Victor Ostrowski, yes.
Victor Ostrowski, yeah. So I brought it up to Nico Pellet one time when I was in college and I asked him about it. He's very dismissive of it. He's like, oh, that's crap. But this one anecdote he gives that really stuck with me was that he said that he said Mossad was, or the IDF was training basically the Sinhalese and the Tigers at the same time. There's a point where he claims that they were marching past each other, didn't realize.
No. So that's one of the lies that he's saying. So
Okay.
The thing you have to take with Victor Ostrowski's work is that not everything he said. He's a Mossad agent, right? It's kind of like how former Navy SEAL guys will often exaggerate their stories. Victor Ostrowski, he also talks about, using a vacuum cleaner, demonstrating vacuum cleaners as an integral part of Mossad training or Mossad operation. And it's ridiculous. It's the most ridiculous story you've ever heard. And he's bragging about how he just managed to fool the people that he was talking to. So the thing with Victor Ostrowski is you can't really take everything he says literally. So you actually have to independently verify what he says. But there's some truth to what he did say in that book, which is the Sri Lankan government, especially we just talked about J.R. Jayawardena, his son Ravi, actually went to Israel to go visit the settlements in the West Bank and take some pointers from them. And he met with Shimon Peres and the head of I think also the head of Mossad at the time. I think he met with the head of Mossad. He met with a bunch of Israeli officials, including the prime minister at that time. I know that for sure. But I would take everything that Victor Ostrowski says with a huge grain of salt. And the reason I know this is because of a guy called Rajan Bhul. Not everything that, I don't agree with everything that Rajan Bhul says, but he has some takes that, he has some perspectives that I particularly disagree with. But when it comes to this sort of thing, I don't doubt his refutations of Victor Ostrowski. Anyone else?
I'm just gonna, I think there's a long history also of the Tigers feeling aligned with Palestine. So there's newspaper articles and ads from the 70s and the 80s sort of with this direct correlation. And then I would recommend, I don't know if you would recommend that, there's a fiction book called Brotherless Night. I don't know if you've read it.
I've heard of it, I haven't read it yet.
I think it does a really good job of showing the impact leading up to the war, through the war, and through 2009 on just ordinary people. And it's written by a woman who has journalistic training. So it's fiction, but it covers the burning of the Jaffna Library and a lot of recruitment to the LTT that I would recommend.
Okay. I'd have to double check that and see, because unfortunately a lot of books that are written about this situation tend to kind of unfairly justify the Sri Lankan government's actions. So I'd have to have a look at it and see what it says. So I'll get back to you on it.
I guess alongside that, I'm assuming obviously if we go through all of grief-stricken wins, we probably get a good amount of sources, but where do you go for actual true information about all of this?
So I get it from a variety of sources. So some of the stuff that I got was from Rajan Hull's website, which is UTHRJ. I got some of this information from PT Sri Lanka, which is the People's Tribunal of Sri Lanka, Permanent People's Tribunal of Sri Lanka. I got a lot of that information from there. There's a lot of, these websites are very hard to access because it's not that they're hard to access, it's just that they've just kind of become quote unquote irrelevant, for like a better term. They're from the 90s, right? They're old like 90s websites, right? There's a lot of stuff that Taraki Sivaram wrote, which I've used, especially with regards to the expulsion of Muslims from the northern province. I heavily leaned on some of his work there. If you want to follow what's going on, there are a bunch of Twitter accounts. The Tamil Guardian is probably a very good source to start with. Lanka Files is also pretty good. They're all on Twitter, all the people that I'm listening. Lanka Files, JDS Lanka, that's Journalists for Democracy in Sri Lanka. This is an organization, one of its most prominent leaders is Bhashana Abewardhana, who I've also leaned on for a lot of this stuff. JDS Lanka Files, what did I say before that? Tamil Guardian is very good. Generally speaking, those three sources are pretty good with regards to reporting on the ground stuff. Kumanan 93, photojournalist, so that's Kumanan 93. Kumanan is very good. For the Chemani mass grave stuff, I've been following Dilakshan Prabhakaran. I can spell his name. DILAKSHAN, and then Prabhakaran as in PRABHAKARAN. That's Dilakshan Prabhakaran. I've been following his stuff as well. Jera Tambi, there's a lot of these journalists that are out there actually covering stuff on the ground for all this sort of stuff. So I get my news from a variety of sources, but Mario Adeldas, all these people are very good people to follow.
You had said the Tigers were functionally liquidated. What did that process look like towards the end of the war? Was it just like when the war was announced over, they disbanded, or was there like a liquidation?
No,
process?
they killed them.
Okay.
No, they killed them. They slaughtered them. So what they did is they captured members of the LTTE and then extrajudicially executed them. So towards the end of the killing fields, you'll see this a lot. Sri Lankan soldiers have actually captured themselves on camera, basically tying up former LTTE cadres, blindfolding them, having them naked, and then basically pointing an AK at their head and then shooting, right? So they're taking footage of themselves, extrajudicially killing these people as well as raping. So in terms of liquidation, it's mainly just they killed them. And then, the LTTE was always sort of a banned organization, so they didn't have to ban anything, right?
You probably have heard of it or read it, but they're radicalizing her, Why Women Choose Violence, by Nimni Gorinathan, I think. She interviews multiple women who were basically took part in armed revolutions and different areas, but she mostly focuses on former Tigers.
Yeah.
And I remember I came away from that, and since James brought it up, do you know is there any kind of, because obviously the Tamil people are still being repressed, is there any
they're being genocided right now.
Right. Is there any indication of other armed, of a return of some sort of militant group or current something happening?
I've had conversations about this with with my Eelam Tamil friends, and the general answer. So we don't know. We actually don't know what's going to happen. As far as Sri Lankan politics is concerned, we're kind of in an uncharted era because the JVP has never taken power. So we don't really know what their rule is going to be like. So far, it's been relatively lackluster. They haven't really addressed any of these issues. One mutual of mine who's a huge JVP fan has been telling me, no, you got to believe me. No, they've been arresting all these corrupt politicians. They've been bringing them to court. They're doing a good job of cleaning up the swamp. My response is I'll wait to see what happens, right? So I'm waiting to hold my judgment. I don't believe they're doing anything, right? I think they haven't done anything, to be honest, right? As far as do I think another LTTE is going to happen, there's an Indian general that went to Eelam in Sri Lanka and saw that nothing had fundamentally changed. Racism was still alive and well. The settler colonies were still happening. Hindu temples were being converted into Buddhist viharas. All of that sort of thing. All the stuff that you see with Israel and in the West Bank, right? That was still happening. I think the overwhelming answer that I've heard so far is no. And the reason for that is Mullivaikkal Massacres are relatively recent. They were extremely costly, right? Hundreds of thousands of people were ruthlessly slaughtered by the Sri Lankan government, right? It's too much of a scar. So I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what is going to happen. But when the Indian general said that, he said that there will be a provocateur 2.0 in the island. I don't know if I agree with that statement, but I do agree with him in that the political conditions for the Tamils have fundamentally not changed. In fact, I would make the argument and say we've basically been reset back to the 50s and 60s.
So other than just learning more about it, are there any calls to actions from anyone over here that we can actually start doing, or is it
organize? I don't have a organize, spread awareness, do teaching groups, protest. I'm not listen. I'm not the organizer, so I'm not the guy that does that's you guys, right? I just spread this information around, and I know this stuff because I've read up on a lot of this, and because I'm also Tamil, right? I saw the war crimes happen when I was a kid, right? I saw Mullivaikkal happen on the TV when I was a kid. I saw Isaipriya, right, when I was a kid, right? So that it traumatized me in a sense, right? It messed me up permanently. So the thing is, as far as action is concerned, anything is helpful at this point. Organizing, anything, raising awareness. That's my hope. It's that I educate, you guys learn about this, and then you want to spread this message even further, and then, potentially say, no, we're actually with the Tamils on this. We're gonna, Palestinians and Tamils come together because we're not free until we're all free. That sort of thing, right? Because there's a common thing of our struggles are all linked together, and it's sort of chanted this in this metaphorical manner, right? But the truth of the matter is, Sri Lanka held a press conference talking about how they crushed the tigers, and they invited 4- and 5-star generals from every country on the planet to learn about the counterinsurgency. So it's not even metaphorical, we're all in this together. No, they're trading notes, right? They're giving presentations, they're giving seminars like this, right? Like I'm doing for you with, talking about the genocide that they're committing. They're doing the same thing, except they're saying, if you want to stop this insurgent group of people, you got to kill them. You got to slaughter them. So that's effectively what they're doing. So my hope is that it just doesn't end here, and it just doesn't fall off a cliff. And you guys take this information, read more about it, go watch the documentary, and then do more stuff with this, and teach more people about it, organize around it. That's my hope for doing this, right? That's my hope with this.
I went down the Eelam rabbit hole a year or two ago, and what was striking was how the UN did nothing. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, because ostensibly they're supposed to prevent this. So I'm sure you know more about what their failures here and what they may have said. Or
the UN knew everything about this. So the thing is, as this was going down, as all the massacres in Mullivaikkal were going down, all of the UN officials were present at every meeting that Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was Mahinda Rajapaksa's younger brother, the Dumar Ben-Gvir of Sri Lanka. The UN was present throughout all of those meetings about the conditions of the hospitals that they were bombing. So UN representatives, ambassadors from every country, they were all present at these meetings. They understood what was going on here, but they did nothing. They did absolutely nothing. They didn't raise anything. They said nothing about it. And the reason they said nothing about it is they fundamentally didn't want to rock the boat. And then later on, there were calls from the UN to investigate these war crimes, multiple repeated calls to investigate these war crimes. And then Sri Lanka basically just told the UN to, you know, piss off. 4 times, repeatedly. Just this year in Canada, in Toronto, the Tamil community there, the Eelam Tamil community there, set up a genocide monument. And Sri Lanka basically was able to say, no, we never committed a genocide. This is, I think, the foreign minister, Bimal Bhattanaike. They got mad. They got really mad at this, and they basically said, no, we didn't commit a genocide. We didn't commit a genocide. No, these Tamils are causing trouble for no reason. Screw these people. We unequivocally disavow the Tamils for erecting this genocide monument. We hate these people so much, right? And then that's the end of that. That's the end of every discussion about this. You know, this resolution to investigate war crimes against the Sri Lankan government is raised. Sri Lanka gets angry about it, and then the entire thing evaporates. And then that's it. That's the end of the conversation. Nothing ever happens.
I was gonna ask like 2 questions. One is like, I'm wondering, I don't know if you touched on this earlier, sorry, I came because I had work. When I was researching this recently, I found that a lot of members of EROS, like Eelam Revolutionary Student Organization, like, or I don't remember the acronym for EROS, but all
EROS,
yeah, EROS, ended up like becoming collaborators with the Sri Lankan government.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also noticed this with like, in Chennai there was a shootout between PLOTE and LTTE, like.
Yeah, there were shootouts between
Yeah.
the militant groups, yeah.
So I was wondering if you could touch on like why that happened, if that was like a result of the Sri Lankan.
Yes, there's definitely some extent to, there's a lot of ideological disagreements between EROS and LTTE. So this gets into a lot of nuances of like what implementation of Tamil nationalism the LTTE is doing, or what implementation of Tamil nationalism. EROS basically, if I'm not mistaken, those are the guys that basically said, no, Tamil Eelam sounds way too like ethno-statey. We want to call this Eelam or whatever. And then the shootouts between PLOTE and the LTTE. PLOTE was always basically kind of India's sort of play in the island. PLOTE was always kind of beholden to whatever India wanted at the end of the day. So that's why there's, you know, shootouts between PLOTE and LTTE. So it was always like, it's kind of like they all these others, militant groups basically surrendered. You know, they were eventually beholden to Indian interests, or they were basically like, they had ideological falling outs with the LTTE, and that eventually evolved into just killing each other, basically. So that's basically it.
Yeah, thanks. Can you talk a little bit about what resistance looks like today? Like what resistance does exist?
Okay, so resistance does exist, and it mainly occurs in very different protests, right? So the first set of resistance is commemoration. And you would think that, wait, what the hell, commemoration is like not a big deal, right? But it is, because over the past several decades or so, Tamils have been assaulted and arrested by police for simply commemorating. So there's 2 major commemorations. One is coming up in November. It's Mahavir Nart, which is Great Heroes Day. It's Martyrs Day, basically, where they commemorate their family members who fought for the LTTE. And then in May 18th, which just passed recently, that's Mullivaikkal Remembrance Day. That's Tamil Genocide Remembrance Day, which is marking Mullivaikkal. So that's one form of resistance that Tamils are engaging in against the Sri Lankan government. So that's number 1. The second is the protests against the families of the disappeared, protesting against the Sri Lankan government, demanding closure for their missing relatives, for their relatives that were forcibly disappeared by the Sri Lankan government, right? Resistance number 3 is they're resisting against basically the land thefts, which is again settler colonialism. They're also protesting the conversion of Hindu temples into Buddhist viharas as a way to try and demographically modify the region into being secretly Buddhist. So they're protesting settler colonialism in that regard as well. So those are kind of 3 main forms of resistance against the Sri Lankan state. And there's also like giving information out, and there's also like lots of lobbying in all over in the West, especially. Like you have Tamil organizations here in DC actually. There's Pearl Action, great organization you should follow. There's a large Tamil community in Toronto that's, building monuments to commemorate their dead, so on and so forth. So the resistance is a lot more disparate, and it's generally speaking non-violent, right? It's not violent at all, but it's basically trying to get the information out there and trying to change the needle and get people to care, basically, at this point. Bashna Bigordana Taraki Sivaram talked about this thing called the closing of the political space, right? The closing of the space, which is basically, the political space is sort of the ether that allows you to communicate with, it is the sort of the ether in which civilians negotiate with their government, right, for rights and whatnot. Now, in this sort of situation, Sri Lanka is closing the space insofar as they're closing the avenues with which these civilians are negotiating with the Sri Lankan government. So they're trying to basically say, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. If you do this, you'll get arrested, you'll do that. You're not allowed to even remember your own dead. You're not even allowed to remember, what happened. You are only allowed to accept the narratives that we've been giving you, that we've been trying to inculcate within your population. So those are the kinds of resistance that exist today.
Thank you.
Is Tamil Eelam is it recognized as like an individual country on the island?
No, it's universally not recognized by anyone.
Okay, so
It was never, it's not even like a Somaliland case where like, it's not a country that even made it into like YouTubers' lists of, breakaway countries. It's just universally treated as like, no, this is a rebel territory, whatever, it's all Sri Lankas. It's not even that, right? So it's universally treated as like it's just Sri Lanka. And that's part of the reason why, that's another reason why this doesn't get as much attention either. Because a lot of Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists and Sri Lankan liberals are basically able to say, well, no, the difference between Palestine and your so-called Narnia fantasy Eelam is that, Palestine was a recognized state before 1948. Where was your Eelam then, right? Your Eelam didn't exist then. So their gotcha is, no, you guys made up a country and you are trying to basically make an ethno-state on our land, whereas these guys are legitimately oppressed. So that's one of the ways that Sinbuds try and basically obfuscate the conversation. No, the answer to that is no. There is absolutely no recognition of Eelam whatsoever. There is absolutely none.
On that note about its difficulties, it's like non-recognition, how do you gauge the prevalence of like Sinhalese Buddhists in like South Asian leftist spaces who like obfuscate the conversation? That's something I've experienced a lot where like it's hard to even have this conversation with those South Asians, considering the prevalence of like pro-JVP voices like in the area, like in space.
So we're gonna have to take this one by one. So the pro-JVP voices, from what I've seen, are just very misinformed communists or leftists or whatever that just see red flag and are like, okay, well, communist, that means good, right? So they're just very misinformed people. I don't think all of them, because again, there's not a huge Sri Lankan population in the United States to begin with. There's not a huge Sinhalese population in the US to begin with, right? So that's number one. But to your point about Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists taking up these spaces, yeah, you have to be really careful because there are guys like Indi Samarajiva. There are these guys that have basically captured these anti-colonial spaces and are writing think pieces about quote-unquote Jewish exceptionalism and all this stuff about Palestine and whatnot. But if you actually dig up their past, this guy is a Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist. He equated, to justify his hatred of the Tamils and to justify the Sri Lankan government's actions against the LTTE and the Tamils as a whole, he compared the LTTE to HTS in Syria, right, to al-Jalani in Syria. And so the way you combat those sorts of capturing of like anti-colonial spaces by Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists is you just have to you have to make sure that this message is more prominent and you have to bring it, you have to back it up with facts. You're just doing information warfare at them.
I was thinking more about the acceptance, I was thinking of Vijay Prashad specifically and his defense of his denial of the Tamil genocide, with these larger, big org affiliated, leftist academics, how, sometimes I encounter this rhetoric being very normalized, you know, where they talk about Sri Lanka and the IMF. They have entire conversations and videos and articles on Sri Lanka, and they don't say the word genocide or Tamil once, you know.
How do you combat that is what you're asking.
Yeah.
If I had a straight answer for you, then I would be doing it right now. I think the only way of combating it is just like you have to spread this message. I think that's the only way of. It's not easy. It's very hard to do this, but I think that's the only way. You have to uncover the truth and show this to everyone. Show the truth to everyone. Because actually, you make a really good point. So I'm sure you remember the Aragalaya, right? When Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya Rajapaksa were thrown out of office, right? By the Sri Lankan masses, right? That's actually when I started talking about this. Because no news organization was talking about any of this. No one was. The most you would hear out of any news organization regarding this is that the Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who were elected into office in the first place, were elected because they're seen as war heroes. That was generally the coverage of Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya Rajapaksa being thrown out. That they were elected because they were seen as war heroes. Now that's not technically wrong, but they're war criminals. They're war criminals that are seen as war heroes. So they were elected primarily because of the brutality in which they ended the war. That's the reason they got elected in the first place. That's the reason I got frustrated by that lack of coverage and I started, talking about this. I've been talking about this for about 3 years at this point, right? And that's when I started talking about this because I knew no one is going to talk about this. I've seen way too many think pieces, especially around the Aragalaya, right? The ouster of the Rajapaksa family. There were lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of think pieces about how, the IMF, China is not actually leading Sri Lanka into debt trap, and this is not actually China's fault for trapping Sri Lanka in this debt. It's actually the IMF's fault. So many think pieces on this. Barely anything on this. Nothing on this. And it's because, partially because the Sri Lankan government has done a really good job of making it look like it's over, right? Nothing else is happening. It's no big deal. They've done a terrifyingly effective job at burying this entire situation. So as far as how to combat that, if I had a straight answer for that, I would say it to you immediately, but I think the only way forward is brute force. I think the only way you can really combat that kind of misinformation from Vijay Prashad, who I am not a big fan of, is just you have to hold sessions like this a lot more, right? You got to do stuff like this. You got to talk to people in DSA. You got to raise awareness about this a lot more. I think that's the only way forward. Any more questions? Or are you good?
Well, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Special thanks to our guests.
For Eelam, guys. Bye.